Okay, we can go get it started here. Thanks everyone for joining. So you notice we have a series of polls there. It looks like you all have been answering those, and it seems like we have even mix of hardware and software appliance installs. Most of you are currently using Kerio Operator. Looks like an even mix of SNOM and Yealink. So anyways, looks like a few of you didn't answer the poll, which is fine. It's optional. Okay, so we'll go ahead and hide these polls here, and we'll get started. All right, so today we're provisioning phones with Kerio Operator, and as you'll see from the camera there, I've got a couple of phones. This is a Digium phone and a Cisco phone. One I'll be manually provisioning, and then the other I'll be automatically provisioning. So there's a lot of demonstrations here, and those will be preceded by some conceptual slides. So I'll be jumping in and out of the presentation. So to get started with the agenda, I'll first talk about the things you need to do to prepare phones for auto provisioning with Kerio Operator. I'll show on the server administration what things you need to configure there. We'll also talk about what you need to do on the network in terms of dhcp and how to set that up for phones to provision on the network. Then I'll talk about adding multiple registrations to an extension, which is required if you want to have multiple devices or a soft client, for example, all registered under the same extension. Then I'll talk about manual configuration and provisioning of phones. Then we'll configure software-based SIP clients, and then we'll finish by configuring the soft phone, or the Kerio soft phone app. So for auto provisioning to work, there's a few things you have to do within the administration. First off, you probably want to define a suitable range of extensions. The default is 10, which isn't really ideal. Now you want the first digit to be pretty much consistent so that it doesn't conflict with dial plans. So for example, if you had 100 phones, you want to probably use a 3-digit scheme. If you have more than that, you'd probably want to have a 4-digit scheme. So here inside of Kerio, we have a 4-digit scheme. So for example, my extension here is 3354. So that's the scheme that we chose. For the demos here, I'll be using the 200 range. So again, the default is 10, and I generally would recommend using something in the 3 or 4-digit range, depending on how many extensions you plan on having. So one of the other settings that you'll want to apply is a master password for phones. So when they auto provision on the network, in order to log in and configure them, if you needed to do additional configuration, you'll need to have a master password set. That way you can log into all of them with a consistent admin username and then the password that you define. And of course we'll walk through that in the demonstration. And then also you want to set automatic assignment of new extensions. It's not required, but generally it makes things a little bit easier during the initial setup. It's just one less thing that you have to do after the phones jump onto the network. So in other words, by enabling this option, once the phone provisions, it automatically gets assigned an extension and it's immediately available to be used on the with Kerio Operator. So you'll see there's a couple of links that I've included here. One of them is a knowledge base article. It's KB 820. So you'll see it's a fairly lengthy article, which is pretty much covering almost everything that I'm going to talk about today. So you can use this as a reference later on. And as well, the other link is to our phones that we support in auto provisioning. So this is on our website under the Kerio Operator section under technical specifications. So you'll see I won't spend too much time here, but I just wanted to point out this table. You probably have seen it before. It lists the phones similar to the ones that I pointed out in the polling earlier. It just shows you the phones that are supported in auto provisioning. Of course, you can still configure and provision phones that aren't on this list. So for example, I've got a Digium phone here that I'll be manually configuring. So if you stick with these phones, it will simplify the initial setup because they can be automatically provisioned, which is basically like a plug-and-play type setup. So it greatly simplifies things. So at this point, we'll move on to a demonstration. And so what I'll do is just configure those items that I was talking about early on. So the first thing that we'll set here is under the advanced options, and that's the first extension number. So the default setup uses 10. You could change that. There's actually a wizard during the initial install, but if you wanted to change that, which we're going to set that to 200. So when phones jump on the network, it's going to start from 200 and move on up. So the assumption here is that I'm going to have under 100 extensions, so that all of the phones, when they register, will be somewhere in the 200 range, so that the first digit is consistent with starting with 2. So you see I've already pre-configured an extension here, 200, and I assigned a user. I also have a few other users just to sort of speed up the demo, since we won't really be covering user administration. So the next thing that I'll cover is the actual enabling of phone provisioning. So that's here under Provision Phones, and if I go to Provisioning Settings, the button here in the bottom right, you'll notice I've actually disabled it. The default is to be enabled. However, that option I was referring to earlier, where you create a new extension for newly registered phones, will enable that, and then we'll also set a master password for phones. And if you click, you'll notice that in certain dialogues, you'll have these little keys here, and that'll actually show us what the password is. So in this case, I've set it as Kerio. So we'll apply that. So now provisioning is enabled. And so what I'm going to do here, as you can see from the camera, you probably can't see in the menu, but I'm pulling up the options here on the phone, and I'm going to scroll down and choose option 14, which is a factory reset. So now this phone is going to reset itself, and this whole process takes about 5 minutes or so. So I'm kind of choosing to do this early on in the presentation so that when we get back to it, hopefully by that point it'll be all set up. So that's it in terms of the things you need to do just to kind of pre-configure Operator so that phones can be properly provisioned on the network. So before you start adding phones onto the network, there's a few things that you need to do in terms of the IP address assignment. So obviously a phone's going to need an IP address, and it's the DHCP server that assigns that. And so in our network here, in this local setup, I actually have Kerio Control, which is dishing out the IP address information, but it's also instructing the phone where to go for its TFTP information, which I'm telling it to go to the IP address of my local Kerio operator where I'm running this demonstration. If you don't happen to have a DHCP server that allows you to configure that special TFTP parameter, then we have a built-in DHCP server inside of Operator, and I'll show that in the next demo, how to enable that. And as you'll see, I've got in the two different diagrams, in the one on the left here, the phones have their own separate network, whereas the diagram on the right, it's kind of a mixed environment where you have both phones and computers in the same network. So just to show you the links for where to configure this, so if you want to set the built-in DHCP server and operator, it's KB1240. And if you want to configure the TFTP inside of the firewall or on your existing, I mean, this is of course for Kerio Control, but you could apply this if you had a different DHCP server. Some of them support TFTP, some of them don't, which is, that may be an instance where you'd want to enable the DHCP inside of Kerio Operator. So again, I'll just jump over to the demo, and this is going to be a quick review of the DHCP options and Operator. So that's configured under Network. And so you'll see I have just one network interface. Enabling the DHCP server is a per interface option. So if I go into the properties of this network interface, you'll see this is where I can enable DHCP server. I'm I'm not going to enable this because that would actually cause problems in our network here. So I'm going to leave this unchecked. As I mentioned, we're actually using a Kerio control, and that's what's handing out the TFTP information. If you are using the DHCP, you'll see there's a button here on the right for DHCP leases. So this will show you any devices that have come on the network and what their IP address is and MAC address, and if you want, you can make a reservation and so forth. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is multiple registrations of an extension. So this is necessary if you want to use the Kerio soft phone and you already have a phone provisioned for that user, or if you want to configure a software client for a user and they already have a desk phone set up. So it's any time where you want to have multiple devices or soft clients registered under the same extension. And the behavior there is that when a call comes in, all of the devices that are registered to that extension will ring simultaneously. So it's called initially it was called a personal ring group, but that's essentially what it is a ring group just for yourself, all of the devices you have, again, registered under your one extension. One thing that's important to point out when you do set up multiple registrations for an extension is that every registration gets its own unique authentication, its own credentials. So that's important to note if you're setting up a software client, for example, manually, as I'll do in the demonstration. You want to make sure that you don't provide the same credentials that are already assigned to another device, as they'll kind of be conflicting, and then neither of them will register. So it's very important to note that every device that you're setting up under the same extension will have its own unique authentication information, and I'll reiterate that when I do the demonstrations. There's a knowledge base article that talks about the same multiple adding registrations for an extension. It's KB 906, just to quickly pull that up here. So you'll see this is the article for setting multiple registrations for an extension, which we won't spend too much time on that because that's part of the next demonstration here. So jumping back over to the administration, if we go under extensions, you'll see actually that the phone that I had provisioned here is now up on the network. It shows me its IP address. If I go to provision phones, we can see that it's set up here, and it's been assigned extension 201. So what I'll do is I'll add an extra registration for both of these phones. So for one of these phones, I'm going to set up the Kerio soft phone in addition, and then for the other phone, I'll set up a soft client that I've already installed on my Mac here. It's called Telephone. So each one of these users is going to have an additional registration. So when you right-click on the extension, you choose Add, and then add another registration. And I'll do that for both of the extensions here. So when you do that, you'll notice it has kind of the parent heading for the extension, and then it's got the additional registrations listed below. If I go into one of these, so I just double click here to edit, you'll see that this extension has a user assigned to it, but you'll notice also that the SIP username has been sort of automatically assigned. You can also change this, so if you wanted to make it something that's a little bit more obvious as to what it is, so like for example 200- soft phone, something like that, you're welcome to do that. I'll just stick with the default automatically assigned SIP username. But this information is important to note. You'll have to refer back to it later, which we will during the demo, when you want to manually configure software clients or a desk phone like this Digium phone here. So the next thing we'll talk about is the manual configuration or provisioning of phones. This is necessary in a couple of different situations that I'll point out here. So if you've got remotely provisioned phones, or you want to remotely provision phones, sometimes manual configuration is really the only option. It's pretty tricky to get the automatic provisioning to work over the internet. Sometimes you can accomplish that through VPN. but that has its own separate set of challenges. So generally, at least from my standpoint, I always recommend to manually provision or configure phones if they're going to be set up outside of the local network. So that would be an instance where you manually configure or provision a phone. Otherwise, for software phones, those have to be manually configured. They do not offer any kind of auto provisioning, or at least not that I'm aware of, or certainly none that support or work with Kerio Operator. So the option there is manual configuration. But as you'll see in the demo, the setup is actually very straightforward when you're configuring software-based phones. Other instances, if the phone actually isn't supported in auto provisioning, so again with this Digium phone here, that's not actually on the list of automatically provisioned phones, so that'd be an instance where you'd have to manually configure it, as we'll do here pretty soon. And then other unique cases, maybe if you want to do some advanced configuration of the phone, Kerio Operator hands out a fairly basic template for configuration. But if there's anything advanced that you might need to do, which is here on the next slide. So for example, you want to configure a busy lamp field for parking and presence. That's a case where you may need to manually configure the phone. If you want to set up any kind of special speed dial rules, that's a case where you'd want to manually configure or provision the phone. Any kind of special dial plans, like for example, we have kind of a unique setup with one phone here. When you come up on our floor here in the building, right away you're presented with a phone that if you just pick it up, it'll immediately dial the front desk. So that's a case where we made a customization to the dial plan in order to make that happen. Also, if you want to add additional lines, so for example, the Cisco phone here is only using just the one line, but sometimes people may prefer to enable these other lines. So even though they're still tied to the same extension, it's easy for them to toggle between callers if you enable those other lines. So that'd be an example of manual configuration or provisioning. Or if you just want to customize anything about the display, maybe a user wants to override the icon that appears there. So those are just some of the examples of when you might want to manually provision or configure a phone. And just to point out, we actually have a knowledge base category that covers some of these advanced configurations where you might want to actually log into the phone to configure some of this stuff. So this is the category here, and you'll see there's several articles laid out. As far as the parameters that you need to define, really it's just a server address with the SIP credentials, the SIP username and password. Other options that you may need to define are, for example, an outbound proxy, the port that's used, a label on the display or caller ID. So these are some of the settings that will apply onto this Digium phone here. So with that, we'll move on to the demonstration, and I'll show you the configuration on this Digium phone. So the first thing that we'll do is log back into the administration. So I'm going to assign extension 200, which is Bob, to my Digium phone here. So the first thing I want to do is edit the first registration. So of course I have two registrations. So the SIP username is set at 200, and here's the password. It's a nice long encrypted, and just a long password, strong password, complex. So now I'm going to log into, so you notice I've already pulled up the IP address here, and I've logged into the phone. It happens to have my session information connected here, but the default login is admin, and the password 789. Of course, a quick Google search will tell you that. So I'm going to start configuring it. There's pretty basic settings, not too much advanced. Some phones have a whole lot of options. This one is fairly straightforward. So what we'll do is just configure the first line, which is this item up here on the top right. So I'm going to set 200 as the extension. I'm not going to provide an authorization name. That's not required in this case. We're going to set up a label on the phone. That way the user can sort of visually see that it's tied to their account and the extension that it's using. the caller ID name. So when they make an outbound call, it'll tell the caller who's calling them. We'll tell it yes to register, so obviously it's going to need to authenticate and stay registered to Kerio Operator. And now the password that I'm just going to paste in here, which is what I copied out of the administration. The voicemail is extension 50, that's the default, so if you've changed that, you'll want to make sure to specify what the correct voicemail extension is. So now we're going to set up the host. So this is where I was talking about the server address and then the username and password, which we just previously defined. So in my local environment here, I've set up a host name as training-operator.kerio.com. So I have some internal local DNS to make this work, but that's the identity of my local Kerio operator here. This particular device requires you to input the port number, which for SIP defaults to 5060. We'll keep the transport as UDP. So generally, if there's certain advanced or tricky options such as registration timeouts, sometimes NAT settings, transport protocol, your safe bet is just to stick with the defaults. Ideally, we'd like to be able to provide knowledge base articles for the specific configuration for all of the different devices if we're not actually supporting them in auto provisioning. So as well, this is a case where this particular device wants us to define an outbound proxy as well. So if you weren't to apply this setting, you wouldn't be able to make outbound calls. So, and I sort of just learned this through just testing. And the phone applies this setting pretty quickly. So unfortunately, it may be a little bit difficult to see with the camera here, but the phone just applied the setting. I'm not sure if you can see it, but now it says Bob at extension 200 on the display. And if we go back into Operator and refresh, it shows us that the IP address and that the phone is registered. So now we have two registrations. We have the Cisco phone, which was automatically provisioned, and we've got the the Digium phone here, which was manually configured. So now we'll go into the configuration on the software side, and just to cover some of the benefits of using a software-based phone. Obviously, there's no hardware involved, so it's pretty inexpensive. Some of them are free. Others have a pretty, fairly minimal cost. It's portable, so some of them you can install on mobile devices. I have an iPad here that I'm going to show you the Kerio soft phone with. So the phone, goes with you. It's not, a physical piece of equipment that's tied to your desk. So even if you have installed, like I've got the software client installed on my laptop here, so if I take this home, I can still send and receive phone calls as if I was local to the network. Also, software clients integrate with local applications. So if you've got Outlook and you've got a lot of contacts, if you're using a Mac and you've got Address Book, typically the software applications will integrate with those contact management programs. So you can get caller ID when somebody's calling you, or you can easily do click to dial. So if you want to dial one of your contacts, you don't have to, you can copy and paste their phone number, but you don't have to manually type it in on the phone. So just dialing and receiving calls generally is a bit easier from software-based clients. So, and also some of them support a lot of advanced functionality. For example, instant messaging, file transfer, and screen sharing, so forth. So those are just some of the benefits of software-based phones. And I've built a little table here that shows you kind of a cost breakdown and some of the common software-based phones that we've tested with or that we've documented configuration for. So you see there's the Counterpath programs, the X-Lite and Bria, Zoiper, which is I usually recommend that. They have a free version, and it's available on all the different platforms, including some of the mobile devices. So that's a good one just to kind of verify if things are functioning properly. Blink, which is I really only use that on the Mac side of things. It's a pretty nice client. It has a lot of full-featured functionality, and it is available cross-platform. The telephone app is a very simple, lightweight program for Mac, and that's actually what I'm going to be using during the next demo here. And then for mobile devices, you can go with ground wire or, of course, the Kerio soft phone. In terms of the parameters that you'd configure on software-based clients, it's essentially the same stuff that you would configure with an actual physical phone like the Digium phone here. It's a server address with your SIP credentials. I tend to see that the software clients have more options for using encryption, so the SSL. I presume that's because the assumption is that with the software client, you're going to be on a lot of untrusted networks. So there's much more need to have encryption, which is more of a reason for installing a signed certificate into Kerio Operator, which is actually what I've already done. That training-operator.kerio.com, that host name that I'm referring to, I've already installed an actual signed, verified SSL certificate, which will really simplify the setup from the Kerio soft phone app. As well, I sometimes see NAT settings within, kind of the advanced configuration from software phones. My general recommendation, because you can already set those properties for NAT within the properties of the extension, I find that especially if you have kind of a scenario where the phones are on the same private network as operator, those NAT settings for ICE and stun actually don't always work, and it's actually recommended to disable those and just use the NAT setting that's in the properties of the extension. And as you'll see, when the Kerio soft phone is enabled, the extension is pre-configured by operator to use encryption as well as the NAT settings. Just to point out the knowledge base article 924, which provides more description of or rather some examples of some of the other soft phones that we've tested and have documented. So now I'll just do a quick demonstration here of the telephone app. So the first thing that we'll do is go back into the administration, and so I'll set up the same user, Bob, who is at 200. So now if I edit the additional registration, so I've still got one registration left for this extension 200, and of course I can add more registrations if needed. There's really not a limit there. So you'll see that the additional registration, the authentication, is 200p1. So I'll just take note of that, and then the password, which I'm going to copy, and I'll paste that into the telephone app. So now if I launch the program, it might have already been running there. So I'll put in the name here for Bob. The domain, which sometimes they call it a domain, other times it's the server address, host name. You could even put in an IP address here, but it's just a way to identify the location of your Kerio operator. So I'll put in the host name, the username. Now it's a little bit deceiving because the example says John, so you might be inclined to put Bob, but it's actually the SIP credentials. So as we took note from the administration, it was 200p1, and then I'm going to use the password that I've copied and paste that in. That's it. So it looks like it's been registered. Let's just do a quick test and dial extension 201. And so you see there it's calling this provision phone. So we've got that set up. So as you see, pretty straightforward configuration for the software client. So now we'll talk about the configuration for getting the Kerio soft phone to work. And there is a few prerequisites, so it's important to point out, especially because there's some server-side things that you need to do first. As I was saying earlier, I definitely recommend using a signed SSL certificate. That's a requirement that it does use SSL. There is a way to get around it. It's a little bit more tricky. And if necessary, I can explain how to do that. But again, the setup will be much easier for the end users if you use a signed SSL certificate. The initial connection uses a secure HTTP connection, and then the actual, and what that does is it pre-configures a SIP registration behind the scenes. So that's why you need to have both HTTPS and the standard SIP and RTP ports accessible. So if you have a firewall in front of operator, you want to make sure that you have both 443 and the SIP ports open. And SIP, of course, is TCP UDP 5060, and the RTP is I believe it's port 10,000 to 20,000. Of course, most firewalls have some kind of SIP inspection, so if you just open up SIP, that should be sufficient. Although, it's sort of debatable, but I generally suggest putting operator on a directly routable public IP, just because NET does tend to create more issues than anything else. So an operator does have its own built-in firewall. Another configuration that you need to set prior to configuring the soft client is that you need to tie or link a user to the extension, because again, the setup on the phone actually uses the user's name, not the SIP credentials. That part is actually set up automatically behind the scenes. So to simplify the setup for the user, they just need to know their username and password, which inevitably, of course, they will. So that's the idea there. But as a consequence, there's a little bit more that you need to configure on the server side to make that all happen. And actually, there's well, so we'll get to that in just a minute. I forgot to assign the user the extension. Let's see. Another thing, of course, you'll need to do is add a registration, which we've already done, to add a registration to the extension. And then we'll also need to enable the soft phone within provisioned phones. In terms of the setup within the soft phone itself, you do need to provide the protocol, so HTTPS and then the server address. As you'll see in the demo, the example that's provided doesn't indicate that. So it's very important if you're configuring it, or if you're advising a user on how to configure it, that you tell them to put the full URL as https:// and then the server name. And then again, the authentication is based on the actual user, not the SIP credentials. And there's a knowledge base article that describes the setup as well, which we'll go through. All right, so now we'll jump over to the demonstration. And one thing that I forgot to do early on, which I should have done, is to assign a user to the extension. So if I edit the extension and I go to select, so what we'll do is add Sue. So this is the other user that I have set up here. So now Sue is associated with this extension, which again was a requirement in order to get the Kerio soft phone to work. So you notice that right after I applied that change, the phone is now rebooting itself to accept the change, the fact that Sue is now tied to this extension. And now we're going to go over to provisioned phones. So you'll see there's an extra tab here called soft phones. So in order to set up the Kerio soft phone for this this user Sue, I have to go here and then I click on Add, and we'll select the user Sue, and you'll see it's automatically checked the additional registration that I had pre-configured, so it's 201P1. So when I set up the soft phone app here, it's going to assign this registration to the soft phone, and you see it's telling me that NAT support and encryption will be automatically set for that registration. So now that that's been configured, I can go into the soft phone client and so you see here I've got my iPad with the software installed. Click on the icon and then it's going to make me fill in the data here. So as I was pointing out earlier, you need to put the protocol, so it's HTTPS // so bear with me, I'm not a terribly fast typer. And so here's where we're going to put in the user Sue, and Sue's password, which I've set up as just Kerio to keep things simple. I'm also going to choose to keep the password, that way I don't have to log in every time I launch the app. Should be a default setting. Okay, so it got me in there. We were successful. So now the account is actually registered. There's one other setting that I want to show you. It's under the preferences. If we scroll down here, you'll see this option to auto login. So I'm going to set that to on. That way it'll automatically register. It'll automatically log me in. So if I restart or quit the app and come back into it, it'll automatically register. So that's basically it for the soft phone app. Let's see if I call that, and so you see there it's calling on the phone. So we've got that all set up. And that's basically it for the soft phone configuration. So that's everything for the demo here. So you see we set up a software client, we set up the Kerio soft phone, and we manually configured a phone, and then we automatically provisioned a phone. If you want access to this presentation, you can go to the link that's provided there. So you'll see kind of a similar version of this. It's a publicly shared page within same page. So it also has a bit of my notes at the bottom. If you happen to have ideas for other webinar topics or other knowledge-based articles or other types of training, you can go to our user voice page, which is keriotraining.uservoice.